why the concept of circular economy is so important. As I said, it's a foundational blueprint. And if we could get more and more of the money owners to agree that this is a good way to invest, not just for social reasons, not just for environmental reasons, but for investment reasons, performance reasons.
We have this real conviction that because plastic is so permeated and woven through every single aspect of the economy and, all of our personal lives, we had to have sort of a full economy approach to it. And that meant every sector, including finance as a major enabler across that. In fact, when we did a poll of investors, because through the Morgan Stanley Institute for Sustainable Investing, we're continually polling investors about their interests in sustainable investing. I'd say with respect to this topic, there's two very interesting trends I would highlight. One, we've seen an increasing trend in investors being more and more interested, not just in sustainable investing generally, but in very specific targeted themes. And when we ask them, what themes are you most interested, the very top three were climate change, plastic waste reduction, and circular economy. Increasingly, I think there's been a real shift of people not just seeing circular economy as something that in many people's minds invokes, ooh, that must mean less growth, right? If we're using stuff over and over again and we're producing less stuff, that must be less growth. People are now understanding that that can actually be an incredibly compelling growth opportunity and therefore investment opportunities.
It really has to go to the center of how we actually think about economic change and societal change. And in fact, one of the things I've been trying to do over the years is trying to help governments redesign their policies. So it's less about kind of pet projects, whether it's around plastic or any sort of particular area. It's really about saying, what does it mean to actually design policy to be goal-oriented, and less about kind of picking random sectors or even random types of technologies or types of firms, right? There's this obsession about small, medium enterprises. Instead of looking at a type of firm, type of technology, type of sector, what does it actually look like if you have goals? And that's what got us to the moon. I've just written a book called Mission Economy that, getting to the moon was not just about aerospace. It was lots of innovation in nutrition, materials, electronics. The whole software industry in some ways was a spillover of that.
If you look at the present state of our industry in many, many sectors, we have to be brutally honest that if we don't transform, if we don't reorganize, if we don't reorient, a lot of our capacity will be lost. Industrial capacity will be lost. Other parts of the world will pick up much faster. But if we do use this opportunity to actually transform our industries, to help them, jump into the 21st century, you will create new opportunities. We're still the biggest market in the world. We still have the best connections. We still have very highly educated people. We still have social systems that help us transform into the new economy. Europe could be the leader in this transformation into a sustainable economy, circular economy, and it needs to be done. It's not sort of one of the options we have for the future of our economy. We can not continue with the economy based on digging up stuff, making something out of it and throwing it away again. Mother Earth cannot sustain that.
Today's economic architecture is not helping circular economy solutions to scale quickly enough. Making an impact at scale means getting the economics, the business fundamentals to work. This morning we heard examples of investment mobilizing within real economy companies to fund innovation, to bring solutions to market, and to drive demand.
But these efforts alone are not enough. The finance sector must move money to increase demand for the right solutions. Policymakers and regulators need to level the playing field. This means pricing in externalities and adjusting incentives to make the economics work. The plastics treaty that Andrew mentioned at the start of the day is a live example of potentially game-changing policy. And as we explore how we accelerate this shift, where better to start than with the largest asset manager on the planet. Ellen is in conversation now with Philipp Hildebrand from BlackRock.
First of all, Philipp, thank you so much for joining us here in London. And just over 6 months ago, we were again on stage in Glasgow at COP. And I'd like to go back to that moment because you said 3 things which had quite a profound impact on me. The first was that we cannot carry on with business as usual because if we do, GDP will decrease by 25% in the next 2 decades. The second was the absolute need for transformation, systemic transformation. And the third was that the money's there, we just need to get it to the right places. So it'd be interesting to dig into those in the light of what's happened in that last 6 months, because the world really has fundamentally changed. So going to that 25%, that's a big number.
It's a very big number, and thank you, Helen, for it's wonderful to be with you here in this great space. You know, I'm an extraordinary optimist at heart, but I have to say, when I think back to Glasgow and what's happened since, it's not a great story. You know, we're trying to do some work at BlackRock to publish our own pathways of where we think we are in terms of the Paris Treaty, and frankly, we're way off track. We will publish these numbers in the fall, but we are nowhere near the 1.5 degrees, just as one measure to kind of remind us that things are not going well. I think we're also seeing, sadly, as a result of understandable enormous social, political tensions related to the energy shock we're seeing, that the real question marks as to the commitment on the public side to continuing to do what needs to be done to get us back on track. And I think very importantly, what I see is a great divergence between the United States and Europe, certainly, in terms of where we put sustainability, broadly speaking, as a priority. So these are all things that have gotten worse since Glasgow. There's no question in my mind. At the same time, the economic cost that I talked about back then is becoming more and more apparent. There is no question in my mind, we cannot avoid the cost related to global warming, to other sustainability issues. We can either kind of absorb it in transitioning the economy, and as you know, that's not easy, and it's costly at some point, or we can do nothing, and then we just get hit with the cost in terms of physical manifestation of risk. And so I think what we need to just keep reminding ourselves, and it will become apparent, but unfortunately it takes time, that the cost of not acting will be tremendous. And I put out that number. I still believe that's roughly right. We will lose 1/4 of global GDP over the next couple of decades. All of us will see it in disturbing events that will become more and more frequent. And of course, we're seeing that every day across the world. And more importantly, it'll hit disproportionately poor areas and coastal areas, which is where we tend to see most economic activity in the world. So all of this is really it's a time bomb ticking. The capital, that the third piece we talked about in Glasgow, it's there. It can be allocated. To some extent it will be. The one good news about the war and the price shock as a result of what we're seeing is that it has made it, the green premium has just been compressed. We have just introduced a global carbon tax in many ways, something that was impossible politically. And so that does create an incentive to put more emphasis on renewable energy and on sustainability solutions in the economy. The capital will move. The one worry I have is how do we get the capital to go where it's needed the most, and that's in the emerging world. And that will not happen by itself, because take our example, more than 50% of the assets we manage are retirement funds. So these are the funds needed for teachers, policemen, firemen, across the world, many in the United States. There's no way we can invest that money into a politically very risky area.
I guess you're caught between the balance of risk of business as usual and risk of investing, and there has to become that point at which things tip over. And we talk a lot about the absolute need to make the economics work for a circular economy, and we see that in 3 areas: the business-led innovation, and we've talked more about more sectorial and regionally, but the business-led innovation, the fact that we need collaboration across value chains, and with plastics, you just heard us mention plastics, you need the entire system to shift. in order to solve the plastic pollution problem. And that's massive investment, as you said, in emerging markets. And then that third part, enabling policy. And when you get to that point of saying, you know, the balance tipping between the risk of carrying on as we are and the risk of investing in emerging markets, I imagine that enabling policy is something you look for to try to de-risk to some extent those new investments, which we all know have to happen.
Yeah, 100%. And at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the rich world is going to have to make a decision that it wants this capital to go where it's needed the most. And they'll have to find ways to de-risk these investments. Otherwise, private capital will not flow, right? And I think we need to be clear on one thing. You know, the amount of money involved in moving us to a decarbonized economy, to a circular economy, it's enormous. We should have no illusions this cannot be solved by public money. It has to be the markets, and this has been remarkable about your foundation. You've always put the economics, the markets at the core of it. It won't work without private capital. We have to mobilize private capital. You need two things for that. You need a price incentive, and then you need the policies that induce private actors to actually, you know, allocate the money where it needs to go. In a way, that the tragedy of what's happening around inflation, the price shocks, the war, you know, to some extent, as I said, that creates a pretty strong price signal. I mean, if you thought transition to net zero was, you know, an economically viable story at $60 a barrel, it's certainly going to look that way at 120. But it's not the only thing. You also need the policies to align. The market only works if you have the policies and the incentives in place. We should have no illusion. The markets are not perfect. I learned this the hard way during the financial crisis. So unless we create the incentives around it, this is not going to work. And the big question is, you know, we are in a moment of crisis in the world. Does that create a moment of opportunity from the policy side? Or are we going to see basically the political side backing off and pursuing other priorities first? And if that happens, then I think we get into a very bad place.
I think one thing that we've seen repeatedly with the circular economy journey, and we've done a lot of work, for example, with the European Commission, is that when you look at circular economy, what businesses want is a level playing field, be that in plastics or remanufacturing, wherever those businesses sit. We need a level playing field to make this happen. And business actually wants this to unlock that economic benefit of a circular economy that we've worked on, as you said, in our reports. What's been interesting with the dialogue with the Commission is the Commission realizes they need circular economy for growth, for competitiveness. Absolutely. For Europe. Now, yes, we are in a different place than the place we were in 6 months ago, but that common dialogue and that striving to get to the same place has been really interesting, because so often policy comes in and business lobbies against it, and you know, this is going to create us issues. But actually with circular economy, there does seem to be that tug in the same direction, because everyone's trying to get there because we know success is different. That's
especially for Europe, right? I mean, and Frans Timmermans in this video or this tape referred to it indirectly. The worst thing that could happen to Europe would be it loses competitiveness on the industrial side because the US doesn't have nearly as much of an energy problem as we have.
Yes.
You know, gas is something like 5 times more expensive in Europe than it is in the US. And at the same time, it fails to transition rapidly. And then you get stuck, you remain in the old world and you become uncompetitive. If you think of European industry suddenly becoming uncompetitive relative to the US, because it has the price disadvantage and it doesn't move rapidly enough into the innovation world. So I think from a European perspective, it seems pretty clear that the sensible thing to do would be to accelerate our transition towards a more circular economy, a more decarbonized economy, a more sustainable economy. And then, you know, it's not just that you remain competitive, you also create new innovation, you create future source of growth, you create productivity, you create hopefully great companies in the future. And that's the story that Europe has to latch onto. The fact that the US and Europe are not aligned at the moment and look like increasingly they're heading in different directions, to me is a great worry, and it's going to make the challenge much more difficult in many ways.
To pick up on what you said about that heading in the right direction, that's one thing we've been talking about a lot here today, is the absolute need for the economy to be the solution provider to many of the world's global problems. And when that happens, that escalates, that becomes a good thing. The more of the economy that works in a circular way, the better. The richer the farmland becomes, the more things are regenerated. And that's a really positive story. And you talk about the need for Europe to accelerate, to kind of to stay very much in the game. There's a need for that. It's nice, that's an optimistic story.
It could be an amazing story. Think of the story 30, 40 years ago when the tech sector emerged, right? Today there's one major European tech company left, really, and even that is not really in the top tier. So we have no one playing in the Champions League of technology effectively today. You know, are we going to let that happen again, or is this transition going to be the opportunity where Europe says, no, this time we're going to actually get ahead of this, and we're going to do what Silicon Valley did 40 years ago, and in 40 years' time, the great sustainable companies, the great decarbonization technologies, the great circular economy companies will be based in Europe. That's an enormous opportunity. But we have to move, and you have to align two things. The price signal, so fossil fuel has, in a sense, become much more expensive, which is happening. So that's the one, comfort we can take from the current terrible environment that, as I said, the green premium has just been compressed massively. And secondly, we need the policy guidelines, in a sense, to be consistently heading in the right direction so that the manufacturers, I saw you had the CEO of Nestle here earlier, that they are incentivized in the context of operating within a public policy framework to do what they're trying to do. So price and policy, I think, have to align.
Philipp, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, and all the best. This is an important mission. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Intesa Sanpaolo has the largest portfolio of financial products linked to circular economy metrics in the world. Mauro Micillo runs the investment banking division. What you're going to hear next is a story about banking, about European finance, and transforming real economy companies in Italy and beyond. Over now to Martin Köring from Economist Impact to lead the conversation.
Thank you very much, Seb, and thank you to everyone for this great opportunity to be here. And obviously, Economist Impact, just a couple of words on who we are. We are part of the Economist Group, so they're obviously published in the Economist newspaper. We do a lot of great work on the circular economy, and just hearing Ellen say that economics is the solution provider is exactly what we'd like to hear at the Economist as well. And obviously, what we have done is we have created a sustainability project as part of Economist Impact, which is a platform to bring all the kind of evidence on topics like the circular economy together. So have a look at that, impact.economist.com/sustainability. And we've also done a podcast with the Ellen MacArthur Foundation on circular foods, on circular plastics, fashion, and cities. So have a listen. So obviously making the economics work is such an important topic, and it obviously requires financial instruments to be in place to support the acceleration of the circular economy. And so I'm delighted to have Mauro Micillo here with us, Chief of EMI Corporate Investment Banking Division at Intesa Sanpaolo. So, we're just going to talk a little bit about, the kind of personal motivations to prioritize the circular economy, a little bit, about the examples of investments and financial products that change business operations, and talk about, what your clients, your prospective clients are seeing and why they focus so much on the circular economy. So, Mauro, you're responsible for running the investment banking business for Intesa Sanpaolo. How material is the circular economy as a threat or opportunity, or both, for your clients, and why is it a priority for you personally?
First of all, thank you. It's a real honor for me to be here in this panel with such an important speaker and friend like Philipp Hildebrand. And first of all, I would like to tell you a story about my experience with circular economy as a banker. It was 2015, and my colleagues working for the Innovation Center, which is a department of the bank dedicated to study all the innovative trends that we can find in the marketplace. And they started talking to me about, circular economy concept. And, when I started studying and learning this topic, I realized that eventually, and this was an opportunity as well as a threat at that time, a new risk factor was arising, from the transformation from the linear model to the circular one. And so we started studying and learning how to develop this framework, because now circular economy is a framework within the bank, in order to evaluate this new risk arising. So when we started, deciding whether to give credit lines with some tenor, or even not giving credit lines to companies that were not involved or were not studying any transition from the linear to the circular model, because this was a risk arising for the bank. This was our assessment, and we were so strongly convinced that a couple of years ago, 3 years ago, we asked for the largest university, the most important university for economics in Italy, the Bocconi University, to make a study for us about 222 companies listed across 14 sectors, to look at, and to study if it was really a new risk factor arising from the the transition between linear and circular business model. And the results are, quite surprising for the financial community, not really for us because we were involved at that time in this item. And, the more circular is your business model, the lower the probability of default at 1 year and 5 years. Not only, but, the more circular is your business model, and the higher is your risk-adjusted return for shareholders. So at the end, this has become really a framework, and what Philipp Hildebrand stated before is perfect in line with our way of thinking at Intesa Sanpaolo.
And that makes sense. And actually, having that evidence base, as you said, doing that study with Bocconi and finding that, that's actually one of the biggest risk factors, not moving to the circular economy is really powerful. So now moving kind of more to the opportunity side of things. I mean, what are kind of examples of the kind of financial products that you're working at ISP that kind of that you have brought to the market, and obviously how important and are these products kind of enabling this kind of opportunity to build, real economy changes, because what we're talking about is these real economy business opportunities, the opportunities to kind of make tangible changes.
So first of all, once we realized that this, the topic of circularity was so important also for banking, finance, for real economy, first of all, we decided to put some money at work. So the first concrete move for us was to deploy some capital. We started with 5 billion euros of plafond dedicated to companies that were involved with transformation from linear to circular business model. And now this plafond was fully used and fully deployed in a few months, few quarters. And so now this plafond has been increased to 8 billion euros just to start. Then, we have been working very hard on internally on our organizational framework. So, in order to deploy, first to develop and then to deploy our capabilities towards circular economy, in general, sustainability. And, now we are ready, to deploy this capability through traditional commercial banking products and services like loans. We are involved with debt capital market, which is quite common and clear, and it's a rising market, very important, becoming more and more important. And we are active in rating advisory, ESG rating advisory for our clients. All these are internal practices within our division. And then finally, we are also involved with a very innovative trend, which is derivatives. So hedging derivatives, for example, hedging from the commodity risk, so the rising of commodity prices and whatever, linked to some KPIs related to circularity that can eventually decrease the cost of hedging for companies that want to decarbonize or want to go through a circular approach. So I mean, it's a vast set of capabilities that we tend to deploy to our clients, because at the end we think that circular economy, we define circular economy internally as ESG squared, okay, which is quite strong as an acronym. But you have to imagine that it's quite clear the impact you have on E. It's quite clear the impact you can have on S. But in order to deploy and to change, to go through the transformation between, from the linear model to the circular one, you need even very frequently a change in governance, or at least a very strong governance to deploy this change.
Definitely, and ESG squared is such a great sign that circular economy is really becoming something very important in terms of innovation, financial products at major investment firms, banks, and so on. So just finally, given that we don't have much time left, I mean, we just talked in the previous panel about the kind of challenges that we are seeing now since COP26, particularly around supply chain disruptions, inflation pressures. So what do you say to your clients who have these kind of additional pressures in terms of when they say things like, the circular economy is too expensive, or if they say things like it's too complicated, it's too hard in this environment? What do you say to them?
I think that Philipp before was really very clear. There is no way back. And if you don't go through this transformation, simply you lose competitiveness. So you can lose your competitive advantage, or if you are able and keen to deploy, these changes, eventually you can gain a competitive advantage. And as I stated before, and as per the result of this study that we gave to Bocconi University, you will lower your cost of capital. Okay, you will enhance definitely your risk-adjusted performance to your shareholders. So it's very important to go forward and not stopping this process. And we have concrete signs, because even very recently we have two very important examples for an Italian company, a steel maker that is now involved, is Feralpi Siderurgica. It's public, so we did a public statement for both, so I can talk about this, and was a circular economy financing loan, okay, 40 million, 5-year tenor, and it's a steel maker, quite important in the north of Italy, one of the most important in Italy, and it's totally linked, the KPIs and the cost of this funding is linked to the level of circularity they will reach in the next 5 years. But not only, they decided, according to the scenario of increasing interest rates, to swap, so to hedge the interest rate risk, and even the derivatives that we deploy to them in order to hedge out this risk is linked to circular KPIs. So the fixed cost they will pay will decrease as much as they will reach in line, let's say in a correlated way, with their circular KPIs.
That's amazing.
So just to make an example, Iberdrola is the second example, 250 million financing. The first circular economy financing in the electricity sector in Europe was a bilateral 250 million loans, 5-year tenor, for a company that is a leader in renewable energy. And I think, again, so the market leaders are still investing and deploying capital, and we are here, and not only in Italy, not only in Europe, but we have a presence in 26 countries to help them in this path forward.
Thanks so much, Mauro. And circular KPIs, really being integrated into the investment bank. It's great to see that you mentioned the cost of capital being reduced and really creating a competitive advantage for companies and banks to go, and investment managers to go into this. So thanks a lot, Mauro, again, for a great conversation on making the economics work from the financial perspectives. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Martin and Mauro. Now please give a very warm welcome to Ruth Awalola.
just good, but better. When a stranger holds the door open, secrets shared, but not spoken. When the bus driver sees you running and doesn't drive off. The decency to cover your mouth after you cough. When you look like a tourist and someone gives you accurate directions. When you go to a party and meet a long-lost connection. Watching my nieces teach each other the alphabet. All the things we love and the things we get. Oh, I'm so sorry, I've forgotten the end of the poem. Things we love and the things we get. Apologies. My apologies, I'm just going to need a prompt. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. A stranger holding the door open. Secrets shared but not spoken. When the bus driver sees you running and doesn't drive off. The decency to cover your mouth after a cough. When you look like a tourist and someone gives you helpful directions. When you're at a party and meet a long-lost connection. The way a tree provides shade in the beating sun. The carpool parents on the school run. Compliments from people you've never met. Watching my nieces teach each other the alphabet. When you're in a narrow space and someone lets you past. All the people that make you laugh. Going that extra step, taking that extra mile. The wonders of a curious child. The act of listening, the art of loving. Trying to do more than nothing. The desire to be not just good, but better. This is what makes the world worth saving. This might be how we save the world. The desire to do not just good, but better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. Ruth is another artist in residence here at the Roundhouse, and the poetry really has been written for us today, so thank you so much. Beautiful performance. Can you tell us a bit about the inspiration behind your poem, and what kind of themes, ideas were you drawn to?
I was really struck by the idea of doing not just less bad, but more good. And I was reading it, and there's a bit on the website where it says, when a leaf falls in the forest, when a leaf falls off a tree, it feeds the forest. And I think, how can we do that as humans? How can we, when something goes wrong for us, feed each other? And just the idea that, like, what we're all trying to do, I guess, is save the world. But why are we trying to do that?
That's lovely. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And now, from one art form to another, we seamlessly shift gears to policy. Policy, I shouldn't have got a laugh, I don't think. As we know, policy is key. It sets the conditions in which businesses act. And for policymakers, the circular economy approach is a way to deliver economic progress while also delivering on the UN's 3 big challenges of waste and pollution, the climate crisis, and biodiversity loss. Next, we're going to hear from Helena Braun, member of the Cabinet of Executive Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, and Helena's going to be in conversation with Miranda Schnitger from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation.
Welcome, Helena. I'm glad everyone's so excited about a conversation on policy. So a little over a fortnight ago, the Commission announced a nature package. And at the launch of this, Frans Timmermans said that this was a socio-economic package and that it was a core part of the European Green Deal. Can you help us make that connection? Why are those two things together, and how does that feed into Europe's economic development?
Thank you very much, Miranda. Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, especially after the long pandemic without this summit physically. But indeed, 2 weeks ago, or was it actually, 1 week ago, we launched at the European Commission a big nature package as a core part of the European Green Deal. And the European Green Deal is, well, Europe's economic growth strategy. So one may wonder, how does nature fit in here? But of course, I mean, for our well-being and for our economic development, we are fully dependent on healthy ecosystems. And if we look, 50% of global economy is dependent on nature quite directly. We have sectors, agriculture, food, drinks, construction, which are key to all of us, that are fully dependent. And, well, actually, the entire economy is pretty dependent, because it's quite difficult to do any business on a dead planet. At the same time, in the last decades, we have been sowing the branch we are sitting on at an incredible speed. The cost of that is huge, the cost of ecosystem degradation. If we look, for example, the cost of soil degradation, for example, in Europe only, it's 50 billion euros a year, 50 billion. We also see increasingly risks for our food security, food production, which also in many parts of Europe is already in decline. So it's quite understandable that the World Economic Forum, for example, already for several years in a row is telling us that the biodiversity loss is the third most severe, let's say, existential threat to humanity, together with climate change and extreme weather events. And those three are all also fully interlinked. So in a way, it's no surprise that, businesses from very different sectors, big and small, are increasingly realizing that the biodiversity loss is a vital threat for their activity. And that is why perhaps we also received such strong calls from different business actors to publish, a very ambitious nature restoration proposal. And so in this context, that's what we did. We presented the first, binding EU legislation to restore ecosystems all across the board. And it's actually also, the first of its kind in the world. And we are not talking here about protected areas. We are really talking about bringing biodiversity back everywhere, and actually especially to the areas where economic activity is taking place. So the agricultural land, the production forests, areas where we fish, our urban ecosystems, our urban infrastructure, because these are the areas where the biodiversity loss has been the biggest. So we are setting, once the law is also adopted by the European co-legislators, binding targets, binding measures that all member states will have to take. And it does not mean that in those areas that will be restored that the economic activity has to stop. It's actually not at all that. It's basically about everything that we have heard today. So if we take agricultural ecosystems, we have to change the way we do things. So agroforestry, using less pesticides, the same in the fisheries area, or when we talk about forest, moving more to uneven age mixed stands, ensuring that there is sufficient quantities of dead wood and so on, because these elements are actually guaranteeing the longer-term resilience of these ecosystems also for socio-economic purposes. We also have very specific urban greening targets to really bring back the greenery from trees to roofs and green walls back to the cities, integrate greenery to the urban infrastructure. And maybe I would just say one word about the, let's say, the cost, because what we see according to our rather thorough assessment is that every euro we invest according to this legislation, or that we would be investing, would bring at least 8 euros in return. So we also find that this package is quite important in order to get us finally out of this myth as if nature restoration was, let's say, a cost without return. I mean, it's really the opposite. We are fully dependent on for our well-being on healthy ecosystems, and our economies are fully dependent. So that's why it is kind of part of Europe's growth strategy.
Thank you for setting all that out. And when we were talking earlier, the fact that this is not about protected areas, this is really about the economic, everything that we are building everything else off, really stood out to me. So in amongst all this, how are you going about it? Where does circular economy fit into this?
Yes, well, this is a very important question, because actually, if we look at in the nature restoration context, perhaps circular economy is one of, if not the solution, then definitely one of the key solutions. And of course, it all comes down to the fact that 90% of biodiversity loss is related to the way we, extract and process natural resources, basically the way we produce and consume. And actually, Ellen MacArthur's foundation has set out very nicely how the 3 circular economy principles, how they actually help us deliver on, let's say, reversing the biodiversity loss. So perhaps the third one, the third principle, regenerating nature, is most directly linked to the nature restoration law proposal that we presented. It's really about changing the way we farm. It's about moving to more biodiversity-friendly forestry practices, restoring our drained peatlands, and so on and so forth. But also the first 2 principles are, absolutely crucial. I mean, we need to design the waste and pollution out of our, let's say, systems, our economies, and we also absolutely need to make sure that the materials, products are kept in the system for as long as possible. And this is not about, just simply, moving from fossil-based to bio-based materials and continuing with business as usual. This is a temptation that we sometimes, let's say, notice, but this is really not sufficient. I mean, the pressures come from the fact that we are absolutely excessively using the primary resources, and we need to, reduce their consumption. And if we, make sure that the products that we produce and that we buy, they are more durable, they are made for being reused, they are repairable, made increasingly of recycled materials, we can significantly reduce the key pressures on nature and biodiversity. This is actually what another proposal that we recently made in March this year is about. It's about eco-design for sustainable products, where we precisely want to make sure that in the, let's say, coming decade, perhaps it will take a bit longer, we make sure that if a product is sold on the EU market, it is fully in compliance with the circularity principles. And if it's not necessarily welcome to the EU market. And maybe the second strand to mention is also the circular business models that we have heard quite a lot about today. We seriously also want to look into how we can really boost them, to bring them from niche to mainstream, so on-demand production, repair, reuse services, products as service, and so on and so forth. Because here again, these create incentives for us to reduce our dependence on primary resources, decrease those pressures on biodiversity, while still keeping, a good economic logic.
Okay, great, thank you. You mentioned there, clearly this has a link to biodiversity. COP15 is coming up later this year. There's also a link to climate. COP27 comes up later this year, so I imagine this is part of the package that Europe will bring to those discussions. And I'm also delighted that we also talked about the wider context, and yet the commitment to the European Green Deal is still very much there, front and center. We are unfortunately out of time, so thank you so much for joining us. Local and national governments are part of this, supranational organisations like the European Commission and international institutions. So in a moment, next up is my colleague Joss, who will be talking to 2 international institutions about the part that they're playing. But before that, just a quick video on entrepreneurship to remind us of what it is that we're trying to incentivise through these policy changes. Thank you very much, Helena.
You ever wonder what happened to your old jeans? We've got them.
You see a pair of jeans, you see Stephen Bethel staring back at you.
He doesn't have the word impossible. Everything is possible.
Let the idiot speak. We are in the SEZ in Gujarat. We're close to Kandla Port. There are license holders that are permitted to bring in secondhand clothing. The clothing is sorted and graded for reuse markets around the world. But the other thing that we do, which is really exciting, is that we are sorting the clothes that can't be resold for fiber-to-fiber recycling. I would think people would describe me as passionate about what I do. They would probably say that I'm a complete nutter. It would always involve a hat, because there's nothing better than a good hat. From a young age, from 10 onwards, every weekend was spent looking at antiques. I fell in love with things that were old, you know, things that had character or things that had a story. I also fell in love with the idea of finding something in an old box or in an old attic that would be a hidden jewel. And that, like, is stuck in me. We started out early on. I had gone to a warehouse where I had walked into this warehouse, and it was a local set of charities in Ottawa that had been collecting clothes. And I walked in and saw all these bales of clothes and the volume of it, and I fell in love. Look at the material, look at the possibilities. There are over 1 million pairs of jeans in this building that are going to be an input to new manufacturing. We're going to make these backpacks. This is fantastic, especially with the inbuilt pocket, and work that into the bag. And then even if we get some other brown or darker tones, let's see what this one looks like. Oh, it's even better. Look at that. Other companies pay a fortune to get that look going. Jaldi, jaldi. Let's do it. As we've become more sophisticated in our ability to make clothes, we've made clothes even more complicated. We use this analogy with clothing is that it's really hard to unscramble the egg. Then there's a conversation about not only what do we put on the clothes, what are the fiber composition, but what are the different components that actually make the item. So much of the clothing is so diverse that sorting and grading at scale, at speed, is really complicated. The really exciting opportunity in front of us is how do we take the material that is in circulation now and figure out how to make it at scale and input to new.
What happens in the site is basically the used clothing comes in. We have the sorting and the grading of that, and we separate them for different purposes.
This is really lovely. It's Mrs. Claus's underwear. Somehow that must have been a purchase by somebody, and it wasn't well received by the recipient. So we received it back. If clothes can't be resold, and if they can't be remade into a new thing, or they can't be a component for another thing, what do we do with the product? And in Sweden, the amazing people at RenewCell have developed technology to be able to used as an input to fiber. You put the secondhand clothing garment in a chemical mash, and it decomposes and takes the elements apart, and then it can be respun into a new kind of fiber. I think what's really exciting is that as these technologies evolve, it will be able to take more and more of a wider array of product as an input to new manufacturing. And the real advantage to this is to lowering our dependence on virgin material. We don't have to use our world's resources to extract things, but we recirculate the material that we have. It is the real last step and critical step in this thing that we call the circular economy. It's not affecting my hat, is it?
In more of a Western society, we've become so obsessed with trend-led fast fashion that after one wear, we'll get bored of it, we throw it away. And I think people need to be re-educated in the value of clothing. You know, we need to go back to quality, not quantity. This is still perfectly good suede. When you remove it from its existing shape, it's just fabric.
If we can start inspiring the conversation about things having another life or the next life, that's the moment where people will stop throwing things in the landfill. It goes back to the days when we were at the antique auctions and I was 10 or 11. You would see value that other people didn't see. If we can do this right, we can have such a positive impact on the environment. If we can figure out how do we use less virgin material, how do we use the existing material, it's not just about keeping it out of landfills. It's about how do we make it an input to new manufacturing at scale.
Hello. I think that was great. Thanks for coming. So I'm Jos, and I'm delighted to be joined today by Shardul from the OECD and Andrea from the World Bank. And the great pleasure really is about putting to the stage and on the stage a collaboration that has been going on for the past few years, discreetly in the background, as we do in policy circles. But we have been working together on the universal policy goals, and I thank you and your teams for inputting into that. We've also collaborated with the World Bank on the report on addressing the circularity gap in EU member states, and with the OECD on the global plastics outlook recently. And Shardul, I'll turn to you to get us started talking about plastics. Last time you took part in a foundation event was in Davos 2019, and at the time you said you had counted 130 different plastic policies specifically around the globe. Just to give us a quick stock take, how did that evolve in the meantime, and where are we now?
Thanks very much, Jos, and it's a great pleasure to be here. Shortly after we spoke in Davos, we were hit with COVID-19, and that led to a partial reversal in our attitudes towards single-use plastics. They were literally on our hands and faces for the next 2 years. And so not only did some attention to plastics go off the agenda, our relationship also began to reverse to some extent. But that said, I think there's a new breath of momentum at different levels. I mean, there are talks for a global plastics treaty, which are underway now. But even at the national level, there's much more action happening again. So just 5 days ago in India, there's a more expanded ban on single-use plastics that has come into force with many more products which are on the list. And that's clearly a positive development. So these policies, the 130-odd countries we talked about, they were largely talking about taxes or bans on frequently littered single-use items. And the impact cannot be understated because they really led to a shift in public consciousness about the environmental impact of the problem. My son, who could only, 4-year-old at that time, who could only drink milk with a plastic straw, that was the only way for him to consume milk, paper straws didn't work. And so I had a challenge, and when plastic straws went off the shelves, I actually hoarded plastic straws just to make him drink milk. But 2 weeks or 3 weeks later, he voluntarily gave up his plastic straw because he also internalized some of the environmental consequences of it. So sometimes public policies do have an impact which can go down to the individual level, even to the level of children. So that's the good part of those policies. The downside is that most of these policies are addressing a very small part of the waste stream, probably 1% or something like that. The other thing is they're not providing incentives for circularity. What they're trying to do is stop litter. So what we need to do, and this is not just true for plastics, this is true for materials more generally, we need policies which are much more ambitious, and they attack, in the sense that they attack the environmental harm that we do all through the life cycle of the material and the product. And so just to give one example with, there's clearly a very ambitious policy initiative underway. That's the Circular Economy Action Plan of the European Union, where they are confronting this holy grail of product design and how to put policies in place to incentivize product design for circularity. And that's where I think we need to devote a lot more policy attention.
Yeah, so if we're honest, at global scale, it's still very much a downstream agenda. Is that what you see as well with the countries you deal with, Andrea?
Thanks, Joss, and thanks for having the bank here. I think we mostly deal with lower income, lower middle income countries, and that's definitely the case. I think most countries are still struggling with the basic elements of the waste management agenda. That is not only true in this set of countries, even in Europe. We know that there are a number of European member states that are still struggling with very high rates of landfilling and very low recycling rates. And I think today I heard the couple of word prices a couple of times. That has partly to do with the fact that there are no ambitious enough policies in order to properly cost waste. Waste very often, wasting does not cost us anything. Landfilling rates in Europe range from 90 to 95 euros in certain countries like Austria and the UK to 1 to 3 euros in other countries. Certain EU member states do not have a landfilling tax. When putting into the landfill does not cost anything, clearly all the incentives from the start are geared towards that type of action. And that creates an incredible inertia in the system. If today a government or a subnational government, a city, had to enter a contract with a waste management company, that price would remain set over the duration of the entire contract. For 20 years, that would be the price. The company is essentially paid to put money into the landfill rather than investing in, for instance, sorting and recycling. But that is not necessarily a bad thing. I think what we're seeing is an incredibly higher awareness of the problem throughout, and increasingly a number of countries that are packaging the waste problem within a broader circular economy agenda. One example outside of Europe that is really exciting for us is Turkey, where at very high level the government and above have launched a very important waste management plan that aims strictly at circularity. Now the question is, where do the incentives come from? Obviously there is an element of philosophy that by reducing the waste upstream, then you also solve the waste problem. But clearly this also has a competitiveness and trade dimension. What Europe is doing is creating shockwaves in its vicinity, in the neighborhood, and countries are really looking at what that will mean for the exports to Euro and the competitiveness of their business.
Yeah, and if we accept the analogy that the economy is a household or a house, and we've seen quite a few nice houses today during the presentations, we need to look at the foundations as well. And to be brutally honest, is it credible to think that we'll get to scale if we don't challenge the fundamentals of the cost and incentive structure of the economy?
Absolutely.
The question is valid for both of you, by the way.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think if you look at the cost and incentive structure, I mean, the question of a level playing field was brought up in one of the previous sessions. We are living in a world where, even if you just look at OECD and emerging economies, governments are providing almost $180 billion a year of support through tax breaks and other incentives for fossil fuel production. If you look at consumption subsidies, the IEA estimates almost $450 billion per year of support for fossil fuel consumption. Now, let's talk about agricultural subsidies. You have $500 billion of agricultural subsidies. So all the nice examples of regenerative agriculture that we were seeing in the morning are not supported by these kinds of subsidies which are promoting intensification of agriculture and not the kinds of examples that you were seeing. So we need to correct the environment in which these innovative ideas that you've seen through the day can flourish, and removing subsidies is certainly one aspect of it. Another issue in terms of incentives is obviously we need to provide positive incentives for things that do make sense. So here, one of the things that's talked about a lot is reducing VAT for repair. And that's a very good idea because it incentivizes consumers and service providers to have these facilities where we can repair products and use them longer. Couple of complications. One is VAT is a huge source of revenue for many governments. It could be 10, 20, even 30%. So you're removing a revenue stream for the government. There are also concerns that the tax code is already too complicated and whether these exemptions could be worked out. But there's also an issue where these kinds of things could run counter to intellectual property protection. When you repair a product, at what point is it repair, and at what point does it mean reconstruction of a product, creating a new product, which might be protected by intellectual property? So there are a whole range of issues once you go a little bit under the surface, which need to be thought out and ironed out, in order to even generate some of these positive incentives that we need.
Yeah, and we could think about, for instance, taxing resource use much more, but that also brings us back to the trade dimension, because some countries in a global economy are dependent for their GDP on extraction, and they create value through the sales of their finite resources. So we also need to address the fact that there's going to be imbalances, and how do we potentially level that playing field at the global level if we want to get to scale, Andrea?
I think, also building on what Shardul just said, I think we agree that you need public policy, and those public policies are essentially three big buckets. Regulatory type of policies, a lot of work is being done in Europe now. Fiscal policy, changing prices, and behavioral type of communication, awareness raising policy that really are capable of shifting consumer preferences. But if you are effective in any jurisdiction, in any economy, in any country, those sort of policies, you do create competitiveness constraints for your producers. Costs go up, the cost of regulations has to be factored in, and those consumers will become less competitive. That creates leakage, creates consumers that leave your jurisdiction and end up in jurisdiction with less environmentally stringent type of norms and prices. And that should immediately translate into forms of trade protection, let's call it for what they are, but trade enabling mechanisms that allow everybody to get to the same level playing field. The problem is that certain countries will not be able to get to the level trading field. You will see leakage move to jurisdiction where there is access to capital, where the risk environment is such that investors will come in, where there's an element of R&D that is capable of copying other type of innovation in investments, but very non-diversified commodity producing countries will not be able to basically get on that level. Those will be impacted. That's why it's important when we think about the trade and the type of policies, we think about how to help these countries to get to that level. And I think companies like Nestle or Coca-Cola or Pepsi, companies that lead big value chains, have a massive role in bringing those producers in those countries up.
One final question for each of you, in terms of getting very specific about these price and cost structure, what is the measure that is not so far away from us that can actually be implemented? What is the thing that we should get started on at country level? The OECD does a lot of policy recommendation. What would be your one measure that you would say puts us on a pathway towards transition?
Well, I hate to end by quoting Yogi Berra, but it's one of those things, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up somewhere else. Circular economy is definitely one area where we lack methodologies, measurement, and data. So defining circularity, at least what's our direction of travel, how do we measure it, I think is a first order issue before we can even talk about putting policies in place and defining whether we are making progress or not. So that would be, if I had to pick one thing, I would start there.
Andrea?
I would say two. I'll try to be brief. The first is, we talked about design today, about design products, design circular business. We have to talk about redesigning fiscal frameworks and fiscal policies. So circular tax reform that brings up the level of taxation for raw materials that today averages between 0 and 2% for extraction and production to something higher than that, and recycling the revenue streams into lowering the taxation, the fiscal burden on labor. You end up taxing employment less, a good employment, and taxing externalities from production higher up. And the second one, a public policy, is through procurement. We've been talking about circular and green procurement, sustainable procurement, nowadays circular procurement a long time. Governments have created markets for centuries. France started doing that. We need to provide those incentives. If it costs a little bit more, taxpayers in wealthy countries will shoulder the cost of the extra cost of circularity in procurement, but this is the way to incentivize business, is to create markets through also the public offers.
So it's about growing the right things: skills, creativity, competitiveness, innovation, and giving, of course, the visibility, predictability to business as well. Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, both, and we very much look forward to continuing the great collaboration. Thank you.
So to summarize, the business fundamentals need to work to have impact at scale. And whilst there is huge investment being mobilized, let's be real, it's still scratching the surface. The cost of inaction is increasing day by day, and investors, policymakers, and regulators are intervening to level playing fields and to put a price on activities that are exacerbating current problems. And in spite of current headwinds, even those that are leading need to up the ante.
In the fourth and final session, we'll hear a series of examples of design-led upstream interventions that are turning ambition into action. That's it from the two of us. We are very excited to have Brit Award-winning singer-songwriter Jack Garrett joining us very shortly, performing live at 5:15. And then Seb and Maya will be concluding the day. So grab a drink and enjoy the show.
Thank you.